Up, just a comment on Mike's talk before lunch. For all the gentlemen in the audience, the questions, how did you come by that conclusion and what do you mean by that? Do not use that with your significant others. I've been there. My wife knows exactly what she means by that and exactly how she came to that conclusion. So do not try to apologist your spouses. Now, we just gave you carbs and then asked you to come and sit and listen. So that's a task within itself. So just to wake you guys up a little bit, I wanted to share, guys like myself and the two Mikes, our jobs are to answer questions. But the reality is that sometimes we ask ourselves questions. You get the sound there? Sometimes we ask... There are questions that apologists ask. Questions like, is a bathtub the opposite of a boat? I don't know, could be. If Tarzan was in the jungle so long, where's his beard? Is drinking out of a camelback just the opposite of scuba diving? If a turtle doesn't have a shell, is he homeless? Or is he naked? If a vacuum sucks, is that good? Why do people sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" when they're already at the ball game? Is the alphabet in that order because of the song, or is the song in that order because of the alphabet? Don't know, big questions. How much deeper would the ocean be if there were no sea sponges? Statistically, most car accidents happen within 8 kilometers of home. So why doesn't everybody just move 16 kilometers away? These are questions apologists ask themselves. Now in a completely different turn of events, we're going to talk about pain and suffering. So hopefully, by the end of this talk, you won't feel more pain and suffering. But this is one of those ultimate questions, isn't it? If you're going to engage people in spiritual conversations, almost undoubtedly the question of, well, if God is good, then why evil? Is going to come up at some point in time. And this question actually came up with me when I wasn't working. Funny how God does that. When I was on public transit on the subway in downtown Toronto, I accept your condolences for taking public transit in Toronto. But I was just talking to a person beside me, and this was right around when the Humboldt Broncos event happened. And it turned out he knew someone who died in that particular event. And as the conversation progressed, not only did my heart go out to him, but he said some very cutting statements. In fact, he said something that I wrote down afterwards because I thought that's a pretty honest answer to a pretty big situation. He said this. He said, "I can't believe in a God who would allow that to happen. There's an inherent internal contradiction in what Christians believe about God. If God is absolutely powerful, he would be able to deal with evil and tragedy. And if he was absolutely good, he would want to deal with evil and tragedy. But this seeming random evil that I see in places like the bus crash, and that we see in the attacks that happened last week in places like New Zealand, or with the attacks on Christians in Nigeria." He said this crash that only happened a couple weekends ago exists. So therefore, the God that Christians and other theists believe couldn't possibly exist. I can't even begin to believe in a God because of such a contradiction. Only a God who no longer cared for me could kill the people I love. That's powerful. That's hard. How do we deal in a moment when someone is expressing that kind of hurt? Now, what the person I was talking to didn't realize was that he wasn't actually pining on, say, the law of non-contradiction that he had articulated, as much as he was just personally wounded, and as much as he was personally broken. And he said it himself. He said, only a God who no longer cared for me could kill the people I love. That's not a logical problem. That's not a philosophical problem, as much as he's just in that moment at that time. And as the video that Mike showed illustrates, sometimes the right response is not, or the right answer is not the right response. There is a philosophical answer to this question, and it's not necessarily when someone is standing in front of you the one that you should give, at least in that moment. But there is an answer to this question. We don't just respond to these types of ultimate questions with a blank stare and say, I'm sorry. The atheist Bertrand Russell, who is a philosopher, historian, and mathematician, he said, how can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? Now that's rhetorically powerful. And first, I want to make sure that you realize that I'm not necessarily coming at this from the angle of a theologian or a philosopher, although I have graduate level education in both those fields. I want to approach this first and foremost as if I'm a human being, relating to another human being. That's important. But I do have a number of points that I want to illustrate to help you articulate this in a better way. The first of which is that evil is something. Now, you might be thinking, well, obviously, evil is something. But there's this idea within our society that Mike touched on in the last talk that morality, good and evil, are not objective in that they exist outside of us, but they're subjective. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, said, you have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, the only way, it does not exist. And to a certain degree, in our quote-unquote post-truth culture, we have internalized this. Subjective morality is determined, therefore, by the subject. You have your convictions, and I have my convictions, and therefore, you need to speak your truth, and I need to speak my truth. It's based on the subject's likes and dislikes. Subjective truths are based on personal and private preference claims. So to put it as bluntly as I possibly can, some people like strawberry ice cream. Some people don't like strawberry ice cream. Some people like murder. Some people don't like murder. I mean, if it's in the subject, who is the ultimate arbiter of truth, then ice cream and murder, I mean, if it's right for me, who are you to say that it's wrong? You might be thinking, that's absurd. Nobody actually thinks that. And I hope that most people don't actually think that. I think most people don't actually think that. But there are some out there that do. Michael Ruse is a philosopher. I believe he teaches at Florida State University. In an article that he wrote for The Guardian in 2010, he wrote this: morality is just a matter of emotions, like liking ice cream and sex and hating toothaches and marking students' papers. But it is, and has to be, a funny kind of emotion. It has to pretend that it is not that at all. If we thought that morality was no more than liking or not liking spinach, then pretty quickly it would break down. So, morality has to come across as something that is more than emotion. It has to appear to be it has to appear to be objective, even though it really is subjective. That's kind of like wanting your cake and eating it too. He wants to say, well, no, morality is just emotions. We've evolved this way. But we kind of have to act as if it's not just emotions, because at the end of the day, that would cause a lot of chaos. But if moral relativism is true, then there really is no such thing as evil. We can't talk about the evil in the world if It's just up to personal opinion. The problem of evil requires an objective standard, or right and wrong, in order to raise the objection to begin with. Back in my undergrad days, I ran varsity track and field. Now, that's not me. It's just a picture of me. Okay, one less joke in presentation next time. Got it? Which begs the question, how do you know a good runner from a bad runner? Well, goodness and badness are made by the existence of some sort of system. So in the case of track and field, it's their times. A 9-second 100-meter is a very fast 100-meter. A 20-second 100-meter is a very slow 100-meter. But there's a standard by which we can say Usain Bolt is fast and Joe Blow, who's my neighbor, is really slow. And this applies every time we use the word. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line looks like. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Now, good and bad are words that are only meaningful in regard to a scoring system, in regard to a standard. You can't say that morality is subjective, just up to your own opinion, and then go about and say, and make a question like, well, why can God allow so much evil in the world? Those two things are not compatible. They appear to be at surface level, but when you dig into it, you don't have a worldview that can support that. It's what philosophers call, sorry, I just blanked. It's what philosophers call planting your feet firmly in midair. You're sitting on a branch and you're sawing off the branch from the tree. It doesn't work. It's kind of like saying, I can't believe in God. And you say, why not? And I say, Brussels sprouts. I can't believe in a God who would make something so distasteful to me. I can't do it. Now that would be a ridiculous complaint, wouldn't it? But that's exactly what the complaint coming from the mouths of many who want to hold to relativism are saying. I don't like this, therefore God is bad. But the problem of evil proves that morals are objective, that they're absolute, at least in some sense. Let me put it this way, and I'm borrowing this from RZM speaker Ravi Zacharias. He says that if we posit evil, we need to juxtapose it against some sort of standard of good. Now, if we juxtapose it against some sort of standard of good, what we are then doing is positing a moral law. But if we posit a moral law, we have to posit a moral law giver. But here's the problem. That's what atheists are trying to disprove, not prove. And the other issue is, where do we ground that moral lawgiver? Well, there are actually a couple of ways that have been proposed by atheists and agnostics within that worldview system. One of them is the individual, right? Subjective truth. You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist. Here's the problem with that. Then we have millions of little godlets running around deciding what's right and wrong. We can't ground that if my wrong or my right says your right is wrong. Who's right? Gets a little bit confusing, gives me a headache. Or they say, well, we ground it in the state. Might is right. As that famous philosopher Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Is that true? Well, here's the problem with that. That leads to tyranny. That leads to majority rule. We don't actually want that in our society. That is not a good thing. The only place that you can accurately ground an objective law is in an objective law giver. Someone who exists outside of time and space who can speak those laws into existence. You have to posit God. The fact is that if you're committed to relativism or natural materialistic atheism, you're stuck with the problem that evil is something. Evil exists. We see it. We complain about it. We can't ignore it. And by declaring yourself an atheist or adhering to an atheist worldview, by supposedly removing God from the picture, you don't then remove the problem, you just remove the best explanation for grounding the fact that evil is something. Morality shows that God exists. If there is no God, there is no morality. But there is morality, so there is God. So the first point is that evil is something. Evil exists, which creates some real problems for relativists and for those who adhere to a physicalist, atheistic worldview. But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of evil, does it? I mean, it points out the reality of it, but it doesn't solve the problem. Which leads me to my next point. Evil is not something. And my first point was evil is something, but my next point is evil is not something. And what I mean by that is that evil is not some type of stuff. I can't trip over evil. I'm not walking down the street and stumble and go, oh, someone put that evil in the way. It's not something we create that we can hold in our hands or that we can run into and all of a sudden we're depraved. That's not the way it works. We need to make sure we're not confusing things when we say that evil exists and that it's real. Evil is real, but it's real in a very different way than you and I are real. We need to make sure we're not giving more credit to evil than it actually deserves. Evil is not something. Evil is the absence of something. Now, have you ever caught your shadow? Well, of course not, because your shadow is not real. It exists. Your shadow is something, but your shadow is not something. It doesn't have what philosophers and scholars call ontological status. That's a big word for you. What that means is that something has an existence, a concrete existence. It has ontological status. But a shadow is the opposite of that. A shadow is not something, but it is something. Does that make any sense? Evil is a real state of affairs, but evil isn't a thing, it's the absence of a thing. Evil is the absence of good. And our language around this exposes that fact. We use words like lawlessness, the absence of law. We use words like disorder, the absence of order. Irresponsibility, the absence of responsibility. Unrestrained, when something isn't restrained. Unruly, uncontrolled. These are things, but they are more than things. They are the absence of things. I'm getting dizzy. And this is what I talked about in my last session. I mean, Genesis chapter 1 explains that we are good. Verse 4. We are good. Verse 10, we are good. Verse 12, we are good. Verse 21, we are good. Verse 18, we are good. Verse 25, we are good. And then, once again, 31, God saw everything he had made, and it was very good. But as I said, all you have to do is turn the page. We get to the story of Adam and Eve, and the testing of the tree in the garden, and their decision to eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and things go drastically wrong. Now, let me just take a caveat moment here for a second and say that that word knowledge that's used, yada, doesn't necessarily mean they knew the difference between good and evil as much as it means and holds the connotation that they tried to determine what was good and evil. They wanted to be the ones that were calling the shots. That's what that means. And in one way, no one can break the law of God. It's kind of like trying to break the law of gravity. If I decided that I wanted to fly, and that I in fact could fly, and then I took my coat and I tied it around my neck like a cape, and I somehow got on the roof of this building and jumped off, would I break the law of gravity, or would the law of gravity break me? In the same way, when we try to break the law of God breaks us. We can't break the law of God in that way. And that's what Adam and Eve are trying to do. They try to know the difference in the sense of calling the shots. They didn't trust that God Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, knew what he was talking about, and instead said, you know what? I really know what's good and what's bad. Unfortunately, we do this a lot. Now, in the statement that individual proposed to me, that very honest statement, within it, he made an assertion that if God is absolutely powerful, he would be able to deal with evil and tragedy. And if he was absolutely good, he would want to deal with evil and tragedy. Now, this isn't something that he himself came up with. This has been repeated through the centuries. In fact, in the recent movie, Batman versus Superman, this is exactly what Lex Luthor says. Oh, can we get the volume there?
The problem of evil in the world. The problem of absolute virtue.
I'll take you in without breaking you, which is more than you deserve.
The problem of you on top of everything else. You above all. Because that's what God is. Horus, Apollo, Jehovah, Kal-El, Clark, Joseph, Kent. See, what we call God depends upon our tribe, Clark Joe. Because God is tribal. God takes sides. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from Daddy's fist and abominations. I figured out way back. If God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful.
He virtually said the exact same thing. Oh, I'm very loud. Said the exact same thing that individual on the subway said to me. It's not a new idea. But the issue with it is that it actually is not a logical statement. Now, this is the portion of the show where I get someone's help. Can I get your help? Do you mind? Okay, I have a paper clip here. I want you to take that paper clip, and I want you to bend that into a square for me. Can you bend that into a square for me? It doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah, there you go. Squarish.
Squarish.
Super. Okay, now can you please bend that into a circle for me? So just round the edges. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. You'll be graded later, but you're under my prevenient grace. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, now can you bend that into a square circle?
I could try. I don't think it's gonna work.
What? You're not strong enough to bend into a square circle, or?
I don't have enough metal.
You don't have enough metal. Oh, okay. Okay, that's a consolation prize. You can keep that. Now, what just happened? I asked him to do something that was contradictory to itself. Squares exist, circle exists, square circles do not exist. In order for it to be a square, it has to not be a circle. In order for it to be a circle, it has to be not a square. But it wasn't a matter of power or strength or desire. It wasn't that he wasn't powerful enough, or he didn't have enough strength, or he didn't have the willpower to do it. It was just a logical contradiction. Any more than, like Mike said, I can't be a married bachelor. It doesn't make any sense. Now, it isn't that God is not powerful enough to solve the problem of evil. It's that the notion of making humanity who are marred with sin suddenly revert to the way it was before and be perfectly good is logically impossible this side of heaven. It will happen. But it's not going to happen. Maybe. So I said it's the notion that making humanity who are marred with sin suddenly revert to the way we were in the garden, pre-sin, is logically impossible. Because we are what we are right now. Now, that will happen on the other side of heaven, in eternity, in the new heavens and the new earth. It will happen. But right now, in this place, it's a logical impossibility for us to just revert. Why? Because our nature is stained with sin. And we have moral responsibility for that sin. In fact, it would not be just for God to do that, because we have transgressed God's law. There is a punishment that is due. We have moral responsibility. It's one of the things that sets humanity apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. For God to suddenly take away our moral responsibility would not only make God's character morally problematic, because it would not be just, it would also be logically impossible. But in the Christian worldview, there is no contradiction between the power of God, the existence of God, and the existence of evil. And what people say they really want is going to happen, as I said. Jesus said he's making all things new. But what is the consequence of what people are actually asking? If God were to show up and solve the problem of evil at midnight tonight, where would you be at 12:01? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, a lot of us are worried about the evil out there, but what about the evil in here? Because I have evil in here. And if we're honest with ourselves, we can compare to bigger instances of evil, but we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Humanity points the finger at God, asking why he hasn't done more about the problem of evil. And sometimes I wonder if God doesn't have the right to point the finger right back at us. What are you doing about the problem of evil? What are you doing about the problem of pain and suffering? C.S. Lewis once again puts it like this: when the author walks out on the stage, the play is over. Do we want what we're asking sometimes? But we can do better than avoiding a contradiction. Which brings me back to Bertrand Russell, because he says, how can you talk about God when you're kneeling at the bed of a dying child? But as an atheist, what does Bertrand Russell have to say to that dying child? Well, let me go back to the Richard Dawkins quote, which you should have memorized now because it's the third time you're hearing it. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And we won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. What does the atheist have to say to the child dying? Well, Christopher Hitchens punctuates the point, and he says, to the dumb question, why me, the cosmos barely bothers to return a reply, why not? I mean, you're just bags of meat and molecules bumping into other bags of meat and molecules. We don't get mad at animals in the way that we get mad at humans for murder. Why do we hold these types of standards? In other words, Christopher Hitchens says, well, nothing. There is no answer. And it's a dumb question. Why bother even asking it? On the other hand, Christians have a lot to say when kneeling at the bed of a dying child. At least we have a message of hope. Death is not the end. This brings me to my third point. God has and is responding to evil. We can do better than avoiding a contradiction. We can do better than pointing out lack of consistency. There's an illustration that the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga talks about when he illustrates the point that there is no such thing as purposeless evil. Just because evil may appear pointless to you does not mean it is pointless in general. What do I mean by that? Well, Plantinga says this: if you're looking into a pup tent for a St. Bernard and you don't see one, it is reasonable to assume that there is no St. Bernard in your tent. But if you are looking into your pup tent for and he has this category, what he calls no-see-ums. They're these little bugs whose bite is not proportional to their size. He says if you're looking into the pup tent for a no-see-um and you don't see any, it's not reasonable to assume that they're not there, because after all, you can't see them. So, What does he conclude from this? He says, many assume that if there were good reasons for the existence of evil, they would be accessible to our minds, more like St. Bernard's than like Noceum's. But why should that be the case? Have you ever wondered about the fact that God might know something we don't? I mean, I shared a little bit about my own testimony in terms of my paralysis. There's no way I understood what was going on in that moment. My sight was too limited. God knows something we don't. And we see this all throughout Scripture. Ephesians 1:11 says, "In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will." Isaiah 46:9-11 says, "I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it." Galatians 50, that shouldn't be right. There's no Galatians 50, that's a typo. Genesis. There's Genesis 50. I just read it wrong. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." That's Joseph talking. Now, Joseph had a lot of evil done to him. His brothers tried to murder him. God restrained their evil, and instead, he was sold into slavery. This is terrible. And then he's imprisoned. He goes through all sorts of trial. But what happens? What they intended for evil, God intended for good. Now, this isn't something that's easy to grasp. I'm not saying this is a pill that goes down with a spoonful of sugar. It's going to be something that we need to wrestle with. And in the moment, it's hard to understand that. What good could possibly come out of this? But as believers, we know who holds the future. We know that despite what's going on, we can trust that there's a God who loves us and that he might know something that we don't. In other words, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. Christianity doesn't leave us with a consultation for this broken world. It gives us a promise of restoration. You see, the Christian gospel, the good news, is that God became like us. He walked among us. And he did so to be with us. So, to do something for us in order to rescue us. This is the good news. God has sent his Son for broken humanity to offer mercy instead of justice so that they can be forgiven rather than condemned. The God of the Christian worldview is not the indifferent God of theism or the aloof God of deism, but a God who steps into his creation and personally does something about it. God stepped out of eternity and put on humanity in the second person of the Trinity to become like us, walk among us, to be with us in order to do something for us and ultimately to rescue us. He was rejected, despised, abandoned, tortured, and murdered. God says, you want to talk about evil? Let me talk about my Son. What has been done to him? What I did to him on your behalf. Arguably, the only innocent person who ever lived was murdered and mocked and abandoned. That's true evil. And yet, what was the end result? God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. The Christian view of God is very different from other worldviews of God, in the sense that it believes that God stepped down and suffered, as I said before. God is compassionate. In fact, the most quoted verse of the Bible, in the Bible, is a variation of a passage from Exodus that God is merciful, abounding in steadfast love. In fact, that's Jonah's beef with God. If you read the book of Jonah, he says, you sent me to Nineveh, and I didn't want to go because I knew you would forgive them. Why? Because you are a merciful God, overflowing in forgiveness and steadfast love. Jonah's beef with God is that he's too good. Friends, if you're angry about evil, God is not your enemy, sin is. Now, let me take a little bit of a diversion and simply ask the question, what makes something valuable? What gives something worth? Things that might be popping into your mind right now are, say, their rarity. Is something less attainable? If it's rare, it's obviously valuable, right? Well, that's not necessarily true. Diamonds are actually quite abundant. We have lots of diamonds. In fact, we can make diamonds out of coal with just a lot of pressure. We don't often do it because it's expensive, but we can do it. There's not a wanting for diamonds. Well, you might be thinking use. Something that has a valuable use gives it its worth. Well, that's true to a certain degree. I mean, my computer has value because of its worth. But if I was stuck on a desert island, what would my computer be worth? I mean, it might make a good chopping block for coconuts, but that's about it. So what gives something value? Well, it's what someone is willing to pay for it. If nobody was willing to pay for diamonds tomorrow, what would diamonds be worth? Well, supply and demand. They'd be worth nothing. Which begs the question, we are created in the image of God, and we are given value. What did God pay for us? He paid the ultimate price. The question of evil, of pain, and suffering is not a question that goes unanswered in the Christian worldview. God has done and is doing actively something about evil, and it will be remedied. As Christians, we are able to look at people who are hurting and able to speak into their pain and suffering. Aside from the fact that they can't ground that. As I said before, the philosophical answer is simply that they have nowhere to ground ideas of objective good and evil. In order to call it evil, they have to posit good. But in a worldview of everything being just a product of time plus matter plus chance, it doesn't necessarily end up that way. They can't ground it. They have to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to make theirs. Even if they want to burn it down, they have to take the smoldering beams in order to create their own shelter. That's the way that it works. But more than that, we can speak into the pain and suffering with the answer of the gospel, the good news. God has done something. He is compassionate. He is not a stranger to pain and suffering. My updated contact information, because I realized the last contact information I gave you wasn't wrong, but it wasn't as full as it could have been, is up on the screen. Just as a plug, a bit of a plug, the work that I do in speaking at conferences like this or on university campuses is done primarily through the financial partnership of people who see the work that I do as valuable. I cannot do the work that I do without individuals who see the value of what I and my team does and come alongside and partner with me in that, in the kingdom work that we are able to get done on the campus. And we are living in an age that has been described as the golden age of apologetics. Why? Because people are asking questions. We live in a world where the worldviews around us are not answering the ultimate questions. Atheism and agnosticism certainly isn't. The spiritual but religious crowd are largely floating with really nothing to ground them in. So if you think that the work that I do is valuable, if you appreciate that, please come and talk to me. I would love to be able to invite you onto my team and bring you into the kingdom work that I am blessed to be able to do. But with that, let me just thank you for being patient. And do we have time for questions? Yeah?